from the ashes you have broken every curse. Blessed Redeemer, you have set this captive free. Lord, I can't help but sing. Faithful you are, faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are. All your promises are yes and amen. All your promises are yes and amen. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. Faithful you are, faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are. All your promises are yes and amen. All your promises are yes and amen. Who am I that the highest King would welcome me? I was lost, but he brought me in. Oh, his love for me. Oh, his love for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. Free at last he has ransomed me. His grace runs deep. While I was a slave to sin, Jesus died for me. Yes, he died for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. Oh, I am who you say I am. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am.
I invite you to open your Bibles to Acts chapter 27 as we continue our study of this incredible book. Acts chapter 27 is a unique chapter. It, and of course into chapter 28, describes Paul's journey from Caesarea to Rome. Paul has been in Caesarea for some now more than 2 years as he has been held in this, I hesitate to use the word trial because it hasn't had a whole lot of proceedings and it certainly has not followed the proper Roman protocol, but he's been held under house arrest as various accusations against him have been, shall we say, haphazardly or at least lackadaisically explored or brought against the Apostle Paul. When he appeals to Caesar, it allows him to have or grants him one more discussion, this time in front of King Agrippa and Bernice and the other dignitaries of the area. And as Paul goes through his testimony, Agrippa concludes this man would have been released had he not appealed to Caesar. That's all that's left to do. It doesn't appear that Festus gained any ground in trying to come up with the proper accusation to accompany Paul. He's certainly got to come up with something, but we're not told what it is, and certainly would not be of any consequence, and certainly wouldn't be accurate. So chapter 27 begins to detail the account of Paul's travels from Caesarea to Rome. What makes it unique, it is one of the, and is recognized as one of the finest nautical descriptions or one of the finest ancient descriptions of a voyage in all of antiquity. Bible readers, historians, and even those with an interest in naval history read this with great attention. It stands head and shoulders above any other literature from antiquity as far as just describing how a voyage would go. Luke is a physician. He's not a sailor, and yet by inspiration of the Holy Spirit and by carefully paying attention, he does an amazing job of describing with absolute accuracy down to the vocabulary, the descriptions, the directions, and so on about how this trip goes. We're going to take some time and try to use some maps and some different depictions to try to help understand all of what Luke is sharing with us. So as we begin in chapter 27, verse 1, we read, Luke says, when it was decided that we would sail for Italy, they proceeded to deliver Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. The we passages, we call it, begins again in Acts for the final time, which means Luke is accompanying Paul. He is with him on this journey. They will also gain a third companion. It will be Paul and Luke and a fellow by the name of Aristarchus in verse 2, who will be mentioned in Paul's epistles as well as one of his faithful friends and companions. Now, you remember in Caesarea that Paul has had access to his friends, or they have had access to him, over this more than 2-year period. I'm not for sure when Aristarchus comes in, but he certainly has been watching over Paul, helping him, assisting him, and so that's going to continue. Now, some have thought it strange that Paul would be allowed to take 2 companions on a trip when the ship, as far as what the centurion is doing, he's bringing a group of passengers who are prisoners. This is the time it's beginning to ramp up, where Rome is beginning to bring criminals to Rome in order to be a part of the games in the arena. Those that are trainable or have some background might be trained up as a gladiator. Others would be released for the sport of either a gladiator hacking them down, if you will, or sometimes wild animals were released upon them. And the Roman games will intensify, and finally, in fact, Christians will be brought into the arena by the time we get into the end of the 1st century and into the 2nd century. So Paul is unique. He's not the same kind of criminal. In fact, his appeal to Caesar is, he has a very thin charge against him. It's really about his disagreement with the Jewish leadership. But some note it is odd that Paul is allowed 2 companions. Certainly that wouldn't be the case of the other prisoners that are traveling. But all along the way, ever since Lysias, a Roman commander, accidentally put him in chains and was preparing him to be scourged, the Roman officials have really backed off and have really been kind to Paul. 1, because of his Roman citizenship. 2, because they have mishandled him as a Roman citizen. But 3rd, along the way, Paul has been gaining their respect. the way Festus addresses him, Felix before him, the way Agrippa speaks with him, then their conversation. Paul has not been demeaning or demonstrative. He's been very respectful, very predictable, very consistent. He has carried himself, as we would expect, as a very godly man. And that's been recognized and appreciated. So given the fact that, for example, he was staying in the palace there with Festus for over 2 years, with Felix for over 2 years, and then Festus under house arrest and being treated very carefully and very gently, very respectfully. As he was brought, you remember, from Jerusalem to Caesarea, he was brought there under a heavily armed Roman guard to protect him from the Jewish assassination attempt. So it's really not that far out of line that they would give Paul this courtesy that he could bring his personal physician, that would be Luke, and some other companion like this man Aristarchus to help him in some way. We might visit, or we might see that as sort of like we see high-profile, maybe we could call them political prisoners, or it's not your normal dangerous criminal that's been involved in violent crimes and so on. That's not Paul at all. So it's really not that far out of what we've been seeing now for numerous chapters, that Paul is being treated with great respect. What's coming is even more incredible to me. I don't have any difficulty with seeing him granted this favor, considering what will be coming in just a verse or so. Well, in verse 2, Luke continues to tell us that they embark on an Adramyttian ship, which is about to sail to the regions along the coast of Asia. We put out to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. So the first leg of their trip will actually be in a smaller ship, a smaller boat, a coastal vessel. And they're going, of course, they're in Caesarea, and their ultimate destination, of course, is Rome. But what's interesting is the prevailing wind in the Mediterranean Sea is from the northwest direction. And so that means the wind's coming from Rome, if you will, to Caesarea, and that's going to make that challenging for them to sail or to travel in that direction. And so this is a ship that comes from this city here, as Luke mentions, the Adramyttian ship, so it comes from here. So it's a ship that makes this coastal route and goes back. I wouldn't exactly call it a commuter. It's a decent distance, but it stays inland or stays in the coast. It's not the kind of ship that would travel across the open sea or across the open Mediterranean. There's a reason for that we'll get into a little bit, why Paul just doesn't go directly from Caesarea to Rome. This is actually the common shipping route, considering the conditions. So, verse 3, we continue to read, the next day, so a very short sail, the next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration. How much so? Read on. Considered him with consideration, he says, and allowed him to go to his friends and receive care. So they sail from Caesarea shortly to Sidon along the coast to the north, and while they're there, no doubt they are on a coastal freighter, so no doubt they're picking up additional freight or perhaps supplies as well, that Paul has. There's so much trust and respect in Paul, the centurion here. And remember, the way Roman soldiers were tasked, it was their life in exchange for the prisoner's life. And so if the prisoner escapes, it would cost them their life. Way back in Acts 16, we saw that there where the Philippian jailer was about to kill himself because he thought all the prisoners had escaped, until Paul says, do yourself no harm, we are all here. So for the centurion to tell Paul, well, while we're in port, go ahead and see your friends. Paul's going to visit fellow Christians there, be encouraged by them and so on, says that the centurion is literally risking his life. If Paul were to make a run for it, the centurion would be in more than incredible trouble, especially when he tells his supervisors, well, I thought it'd be fine for him to visit his friends. There's no mention here of Paul being accompanied by armed guards or put in chains. I would suggest that if armed guards were needed, why send him? Why not just keep him on the ship? Why mess with that hassle? There's no compelling reason, certainly not from Roman interest, to allow Paul to do anything in Sidon. So it just underscores the powerful words that Luke says, that he treated Paul with consideration. Now we continue to read in verse 4, from there we put out to sea, and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary, or the winds were against us. So they've moved from Caesarea to Sidon, and they're going along this coastal route, and they're going to benefit. Since the wind primarily comes out of the northwest, the island of Cyprus is going to create a wind shadow and give them an advantage, keep them out of the opposing wind, allow them to travel up north. Along the coast, you can get local winds that can be very different in direction and in velocity than the prevailing winds because of the local exchanges that goes on in the environment. So, for example, the land sea breeze is known by sailors around the world in that the land will typically heat up and cool faster than the ocean being a massive body of water. It's going to have a more temperate condition. It'll maintain the same temperature through the day, through the night, than the land will. So as the sun comes up, the land heats up quicker, so the warmer air rises, and that pulls colder air into the land. And so for a bit, in the first part of the day, you'll get a wind right out of the west, not just the northwest, which if you have Cyprus blocking this wind and you get a nice little onshore westerly, that's just about the right angle to make progress to the north. As the sun sets, then the land is going to cool, or as you get into late afternoon, early evening, depending on the time of year, of course, the land's going to cool quicker, and so that cold air will sink. It's warmer out to sea, and so the air is going to move back to the west, coming out of the east or coming off of the land. And so in both cases, they'll have an eastern or westerly wind allow them to travel to the north because Cyprus creates, that island creates that wind shadow and allows them to come up north above the island. So that's the route that they take. Rather than trying to go straight out this way, they won't get the advantage of the land sea breeze, and they will not have the protection or the wind shadow of the island of Cyprus. So they sail this direction because the winds are contrary. Verse 5, when we sailed through the sea along the coast of Sicily and Pamphylia, we landed at Myrna in Lycia. So they make the corner, again protected by the coast from the prevailing winds, having the advantage again of the land sea breezes, but that's still going to be very slow progress. Those breezes are not going to be near as dominant. They'll only be for a few hours at each part of the day, and so it'd be all you can do during the rest of the day and the night to not go backwards with the wind, and so you're either going to work slowly, tacking back and forth, perhaps anchor, depending on where you are, to get all the way here to Myrna, which they finally arrive at from off the region of Lycia. Now from there, they're going to transfer, because this coastal ship's going to keep working up the coast back to its home port. Well, they're going to leave it here and take the larger ship to Rome. This map may or may not be clearer. They start in Caesarea, they go to Sidon. They're going to stay under that wind shadow of Cyprus to round up and over to the north, and then head to the west and end up in Myrna. Now, what's interesting is this route follows the ancient shipping routes, and again, you can get a feel for how much time this takes. We're much more accustomed in the era of automobiles, airplanes, powered ships, that we work less with the environment than we work against it or prevail over it. It still affects us. An airplane or a ship, for example, is very affected by the wind in terms of speed and economy, but still there is the possibility, generally speaking, to continue to travel, where in a sailing ship it would be quite different. So if the wind prevails from this direction, from the northwest, then the way shipping would be routed in the Mediterranean, if you were traveling from Rome to Caesarea, that's a fairly quick trip. Depending on the wind strength and other issues, it can be as somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 weeks to travel from Rome to Caesarea. But with the ships they have, we'll talk about their design in a moment, they can't go straight upwind like, say, a ship powered by a diesel engine can. So they have to go the coastal route to stay out of the heavy wind and to benefit from the land sea breezes. So it's going to take this very slow, very tedious route along the coast and then coming down underneath the island of Crete for a wind shadow, or trying to go across the top. And even as they finally break out, they're going to have to wait for the proper wind directions. Because when we say the wind is predominantly from the northwest, we don't mean that it's only from the northwest. As a low comes in, it typically comes in from the west. And as the air pressure swirls around in a clockwise manner and that low moves, then the wind is going to blow around the compass as that system moves through. And so those are all the kinds of things that sailors had to wait for. They had to be patient. They had to wait for a weather system to come through so the winds that would change. So though the predominant wind was from the northwest, there were periods, not predominantly, but there were periods when the wind would shift and make it favorable. And so generally you could make a pretty good run to the southeast, but if you were going northwest into the teeth of that predominant direction, you'd have to take advantage of all these little tricks, the wind shadows, the wind breaks, the currents, the land-sea breezes, the weather changes that would allow you some alternative wind directions. So the kind of ship that the Apostle Paul is going to get on, he was on a coastal vessel moving this way, but to cross the open fetches or the open areas of water, he's going to board here in Myrna. It says in verse 6, there the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us aboard it. So the ships sailing from Alexandria, from down across Egypt, regularly carry this grain cargo going to Rome, and they also carried sand and other things for construction, the arena, and so on. Well, they have the same problem. They can't just head right into that breeze, so they often will go across and then work their way depending on favorable wind conditions. Now, the ancient ship that the Apostle Paul was embarking on was something like this, based on some wrecks that have been found and some descriptions that have been found. The Alexandrian grain ships would have been something like this. There is what's considered a far second best nautical voyage. There's a description of a fellow that actually travels by an Alexandrian grain trip from Alexandria to Rome, and he talks about the ship a little bit, and he describes it as 180 feet long. He was amazed at how large it was. And of course, this is a ship that's made out of timber or out of wood, out of planks, a total wood construction. About 180 feet long, 45 feet wide, and about 44 feet from the keel, from the very bottom of the ship to the tallest part of the decks, what would have been considered the cabin or the afterdeck, and that it would have carried about 2,000 tons in terms of displacement, which is a very large ship, even up until recent times, even when we get into such things as a Revolutionary War or the War of 1812, when you've got the square rig ships battling England and the U.S. and France and England, and you look at their old galleons and frigates and all that, this is a equal type size ship. It's certainly big enough for the job. It is not the smaller coastal vessel. It's the larger ocean-going ship or the one that's intended to cross the open seas. The Mediterranean Sea is quite an interesting inland sea. It's quite large. Its average depth is about 4,500 feet, and its deepest point is about 16,000 feet. What's kind of fascinating is the way scientists look at the Mediterranean, and they'll talk about how it was obviously carved by some giant deluge. Let's see if you go backwards a little bit to this map. That this at one point was dry, and this mountain range here sealed it off from the ocean, but they talk about some great deluge, some great enormous rain, some great enormous flood caused the water start flowing over that mountain ridge where we would call the Rock of Gibraltar, and as it flowed over it, it eroded it till it finally made a cut, and then the water blasted through, because there would have been a difference in height between those two of hundreds and hundreds of feet, which would have created a tremendous torrent of water. This area to this day through the Strait of Gibraltar is very carved. It's been swept clean. There's evidence the scars along the seafloor show a tremendous current had flown in there and had filled this Mediterranean, according to modern scientists, in just a matter of days and weeks. It would have been a tremendous thing. Well, I would suggest they're right. There was a great deluge. There was a great rain, and it's called the flood, would have certainly accomplished those things. So it's quite a sea. It's by no means a pond or a small body of water. capable as other oceans of producing its own weather systems and its own storms and its own issues. So you're going to need the larger ship for sure to traverse that kind of open water. Smaller boats can do it. You can float across it on a raft, but it's not something you'd want to do regularly, and certainly not with a cargo. Now, one of the challenges as we think about this kind of rigging, this square sail type of design, which would be the prominent design, the triangular sail wouldn't appear for many centuries later. The next sort of following the square sail is the lateen rig, which still wouldn't come for some time. The square sail would be the predominant sail design of the day. So sailboats have a challenge. They have to deal with the direction and, of course, the velocity of the wind. And so sailboats cannot sail straight upwind. It's called the no-sail zone. But what's interesting is, of course, they can go downwind. The wind can push them along, which actually is not the fastest nor the most efficient direction for a sailboat. Because of the way the sails funnel the air and it's able to blow across the sail and has a similar effect like an airplane wing, and then the keel, the bottom of the boat, down in the water is able to get traction in the water. And it also functions like a hydrofoil, again, sort of like an airplane wing. A sailboat can actually go against the wind, not straight into it, but at a certain angle. What's really fascinating is that a modern sailboat design can come somewhere around 30 degrees off the wind. So what that means is if your destination is upwind and you're down here, let me reverse it first. If you're going to go with the wind, let's say this is Rome and this is Caesarea, just go right along with the wind. That's pretty easy. And a square-sailed rig is certainly well designed for that. But when you want to go from Caesarea to Rome, now you got to go upwind. You can't go straight upwind. So you can sail at an angle to the wind, and you'll have to zigzag back and forth and make your way slowly upwind. But the ground you're covering, or the water you're sailing, however you want to think about that, can easily be at least twice as far, if not much more, depending on the angle. Obviously, the broader the angle, the bigger the zigzags, the more you travel sideways, and the less you actually move upwind. So a modern sailboat can come around 30 degrees into the wind. Some of the high efficient designs like racing sailboats can sometimes get as close as 20 degrees. It's called pointing into the wind. The way the sails capture the wind and funnel the wind, it's just incredible how close they can come to going upwind. Well, the closer the angle, the less sideways zigzag that you have to make. Now, the Apostle Paul was not sailing on a high-performance racing sailboat like this. As we mentioned, the Alexandrian and even the coastal ship would have looked something like this. This is a replica, certainly a much smaller scale. This little boat is nowhere near 180 feet long, and in fact would have been considerably smaller than even the coastal vessel. But this was built as a replica, and it was sailed along the ancient sailing or shipping routes in the Mediterranean to kind of work with that idea. Here you can see the square sail, but the wind's coming from this direction off of their left shoulder here, and they're trying to go upwind. The wind's blowing this way, they're going that way. If they were going straight downwind, you'd see the sail around the front of the boat. So they're going upwind or tacking or pointing into the wind about as much as they can with that design. So again, the efficiency can really make a difference. If you're sailing a boat that's got a 20-degree angle off the wind, you can work your way up fairly quickly. But if you're sailing one of those old square-rigged or square-sailed vessels, the best that they can do, if a modern sailboat can point between 20 and 30 degrees, the ancient ships, the best that they could do is about 60 degrees. The ships like we had just mentioned with the square sail, about 60 degrees is the best they could do. Now, 90 degrees is the wind coming straight off your shoulder, and at 90 degrees, you can go back and forth and never move upwind. There's no forward in the zigzag, you're just going back and forth. So at some point, you have to just stop and wait. It's not worth sailing, and you wait for the wind to shift to go in a different direction. The other thing that sailboats do is that it's called leeway, is they also drift sideways in the wind. As the wind pushes against them as they're going in that zigzag, they're getting pushed downwind a little bit. And depending on the keel's performance, that underwater part that looks like a little wing sticking down in the water, different designs have different kinds of tracking ability. So ancient ships like this, if you add the angle they can point into the wind, subtract the angle that they push down or they drift, then the best that these older ship designs could do was somewhere in the 70 to 80 degrees. That's not a lot more than 90 degrees, and that certainly would give you this long track. And this is quite a bit better than 70 to 80 degrees. 90 degrees would be this direction. So 70 to 80 would be about here, and you could see where it would take forever at that angle to finally get up to your destination. So Luke describes their journey as difficult because the winds were contrary or against them. And so they're having to work. They've had the coastal route, and here's a depiction of the kind of tacking, because if the predominant wind's out of the northwest, they're having to tack and work to get there with this particular kind of sailing with the winds contrary, verse 4, against them. Once they get on the Alexandrian ship, bound for Italy, they get on it in verse 6, verse 7, when we had sailed slowly for a good many days and with difficulty had arrived off of Cnidus, since the wind did not permit us to go further, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off of Salome. So here they leave Myra, and they're trying to go this direction, but the wind's against them, and they have to go very, very, very slowly. So they're going to have the wind's blowing this way. They're trying to track that way. They're also drifting, so this would be a very, very, very slow sailing. And I don't know exactly what the wind direction was. I just know it was against them. So I don't know, too, how often they have to tack. By doing this, they get some wind shadow protection from this chain of islands. And then Luke says they get under Crete. They get under that. That's going to block the wind, and that gives them that little small land-sea breeze. Sometimes you'll get, as the wind comes over those peaks, which can be like 7,000 feet, you can get a swirl where the wind goes the other way if you stay real close. So it's a whole bunch of tacking, a whole bunch of drifting, and that's the way Luke describes it. When we had sailed slowly for a good many days, and we had arrived off Cnidus, since the wind didn't permit us to go further, we sailed under the shelter. So here's Cnidus. They're not able to make that direction, so they have to give up and sail underneath the lee or the shadow, and finally the shadow of Crete. So rather than trying to go this way, which would be one of the ancient shipping routes, they have to give way to the wind and try to round it out and go this way and take advantage of how the island of Crete can block them. Verse 8, and with difficulty sailing past it, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. So after all that effort, they come here into a place off the island of Crete called Fair Haven. Now, the other thing that's happening, we're going to read about in a few verses about the time of the fast, which means this is all taking place because of the way the feasts are dated, that this is probably October 5th, give or take a day, because of what Paul will mention in a few verses about the fast or one of the feasts of the Jews. Well, that's a problem sailing in October, because they're in the winter months when the wind is predominantly out of the northwest. And so generally speaking, from mid-September to early November, any voyages on the Mediterranean, and certainly any that were bound to the northwest, were considered hazardous. It was not the time to be sailing, that you would only be making such trips if this were really an important or a urgent matter. That shipping really slows down because the odds are that there's going to be winter storms, which will be brutal and will sweep out of the north, which would cause a great difficulty. One of the issues with the Mediterranean that's different than some regions of the Pacific and the Atlantic is that when you get into a storm, one of the things that ships do is kind of give to it and kind of allow themselves to be blown downwind. The trouble with the Mediterranean is there's just not that much room. They don't have thousands of miles of sea room. There is a hostile shoreline all along to the south, and so they can't just give forever or they'll get washed up on a shoreline somewhere and come to great harm. Well, so from September to November is considered a hazardous time to travel. Well, they're in October. From November 11th, by Roman record and the notes of the voyages in antiquity, that in the Mediterranean it was considered worse than dangerous to travel from November 11th to March 10th. All voyages were canceled. Now, that doesn't stop some private fellow. He wants to make a run for it, or perhaps there's some weird week where the weather opens up. But as far as scheduled routes were canceled from November 11th to March 10th because that's when the winter storms were at their fiercest peak. So if they're sailing in early October, they're right in the cusp of that danger. They're already in the dangerous time. They're post-September, and they're pushing into, from we might call it the yellow cautionary time, they're pushing right into the red dangerous time to travel. So, verse 9, when considerable time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, so we're post October 5th, Paul began to admonish them and said to them, Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and of the ship, but also of our lives. Now, Paul here is not giving them a prophecy. He will do that later, but only after the angel of the Lord tells him, and he will tell them in verse 23, this very night an angel of God told me this. So he'll tell them when it's a prophetic statement or promise from God. Here he's saying, I perceive, it seems from my judgment, that this is not a good time to travel, that bad things are going to happen. You say, well, Paul's not a sailor. Well, no, he's not. But through his journeys and his various, the previous 3 missionary journeys, Paul has traveled by ship around and across the Mediterranean, especially around this coastal route, this area here, up into Asia and Asia Minor and back several times. In fact, in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 25, if you'd like to turn there real quick, it's something that we don't often think about. Paul's shipwreck here in Acts 27 is certainly the most well-known, certainly the most famous. But Paul says something pretty interesting in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 as he talks about all the difficult things that he has suffered as far as his work as a missionary and his life as a Christian. In the middle of that, like we'll just drop into verse 24, he says, 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. And then he says, 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have spent in the deep. Paul's already then, before we're talking about Acts 27, he's already been shipwrecked 3 times. So he's already experienced storms that overwhelm the ship. Now, very likely he's been on the coastal ships, which are smaller, which would not have handled the storm as well, but they also wouldn't be out in the worst of it. They would be closer to protection, a closer opportunity to run into a harbor, to get out of the weather, to find a safe anchorage and get some kind of protection. In spite of that, he's been shipwrecked 3 times, and in one of those shipwrecks, he talks about floating among the wreckage all night and all day. So let's go back to Acts 27. When Paul says, I perceive, he's not just talking out of thin air. It's not a prophecy. God hasn't told him this yet. He will later in verse 23. But at this point, this is just Paul saying common sense, folks. And it's not something that's unknown. The sailors know that too. They know they're in the dangerous part of the year, and they're edging up on the time when the voyages would be canceled. Now that may be part of the problem here, is if the scheduled routes are about to be canceled sometime around November the 11th and they're already in October, then they're running out of time. If they don't get to Rome in the next, let's say, month, then they're going to get stuck having to winter over somewhere until spring. There's a condition that pilots have to deal with called get-there-itis, and it's a problem where I really got to get there. I really got to get to this destination. And that lures pilots into taking off and trying to travel in weather for which they or their aircraft are not equipped, and really terrible consequences can follow. There's times when you just have to say, we'll just have to sleep on the couch at the airport manager's office because the weather's just not right enough or it's not safe enough. And that's the problem here. They're right up against a very, very real deadline, and the fact that it is dangerous will be proven by the coming storm that will lead to their shipwreck. So what Paul is saying is absolutely legitimate. So he warns them about this coming loss because he's been shipwrecked 3 times. Now he has such respect from at least the centurion that he had been allowed, as you remember, to travel to see friends in Sidon, which would have been a huge security risk. And Paul, the way he carries himself and his demeanor, would speak as one who has experience. Verse 11, Luke says, "But the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than what was being said by Paul." Paul is a reputable person. Obviously, he has the centurion's respect. However, you could certainly see where the sailing captain or the pilot, this is the man that's going to guide them, and he's supposed to know the weather and the conditions and the charts and all that. He's the local expert. He should really know. And then, of course, the captain should be the one who has the ultimate say in what's going to go on. So it makes sense where the pilot and the captain, or the sailing master, some translations say, and the captain, certainly their opinion would outweigh Paul, and ultimately the sailing master and the captain would make the decisions. Very unlikely that the Roman centurion, as a soldier, would have the yes or no call about whether the voyage would continue. Now, the difficulty is they're in Fair Havens, but verse 12 says, "Because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there if somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there." So they've made it to Fair Havens. What they would like to do is make it over here to Phoenix, which is on the western end of Crete. And the advantage is the Fair Havens harbor is more exposed, and so when a great storm would come, they don't have a lot of great protection. And that's a valid point, but sometimes not having great protection might be better than the great risk of going out into the open sea. But that's their thought process, and it makes sense if they can. They're just trying to get to Phoenix. They're not trying to cross over to Sicily. They're not trying to go down to Alexandria. They just need to hop over just a little short trip, about 40 miles or so, and then that's a much better harbor, and then they can winter there, and no harm is done. Everybody's safe. Everything's great. That's what they would like to do. Well, that's going to be pretty tough, though, if the wind's coming out of the northwest. They're going to have to work upwind with all that we've talked about. Verse 13 says, "When a moderate south wind came up," which as a weather system will come through, a weak low will cause that wind to flow around counterclockwise and give you a little south breeze. Perfect. It's just what they need. A nice mild breeze. They're just going to Phoenix. It's not that far. If they can just slip over there and then they can hunker down and winter through, everything would be great. So when a moderate south wind came up, supposing that they had attained their purpose, they weighed anchor, they lifted up the anchor. That's a great sailing term. And they began sailing along Crete close inshore. They're going to just follow the coast here very carefully and stay protected, stay out of the exposure of the northwest wind, use that soft little south wind and just let them lift them right into Phoenix, and all will be well, except all doesn't go well. The great storm comes upon them. It comes out of the north. Euraquilo is the expression that's used in verse 14. It comes from the Greek word that we get the word typhoon. and it's the word for, literally means devil storm. A typhoon is our word for hurricane. It is a violent and tremendous storm that will last for 2 weeks. We'll talk more about this storm and about where it takes them and the steps that they have to take. It's still some pretty interesting things as they deal with this storm and how God uses Paul to instill faith in others and bring about his purpose. We'll see you next time as we talk more about the storm.
The ground began to shake. The stone was rolled away. His perfect love could not be overcome. Now death, where is your sting? Our resurrected King has rendered you defeated. Forever He is glorified. Forever He is lifted high. Forever He is risen. He is alive. He is alive. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. The Lamb is overcome. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. The Lamb is overcome. Forever He is glorified. Forever He is lifted high. Forever He is risen. He is alive. He is alive.